So example number 3 is the example that I think a lot of people have been waiting for. It's human societal development, or history, maybe even. And I have a lot more to say than what's in these slides, and I'm going to say a little more than what's in these slides, but I think I might also just kind of make an addendum video where I explain this in more detail, because I think it deserves more detail than it would be appropriate to give it in the context that we're talking about it here. So with that said, so humans are like any other animal. We should start from viewing humans as animals in the wild. And humans, like any other animal, need to work to survive. They need to do labor. There are two things that separate humans from other animals, in my opinion. The first thing is that we labor socially. We work together to reproduce our existence. We don't fend for ourselves. We work in little tribes, or at least we did. We work as a society of some sort. In order to you produce this, I produce that. You do this part of the job, I'll do this part of the job, and hopefully it'll work out so that everybody gets what they need at the end, right? That's social labor. So we labor socially, but we're not the only animals that do that. Termites do that, right? Termites are divided into jobs, right? You've got soldier termites, you've got worker termites, you've got breeders, termites, and so forth. What's the difference then between humans and termites? Well, the difference is actually simpler than you think. The difference is just that humans, unlike termites, are born more or less homogeneous. Termites are born workers, or they're born soldiers. They have completely different biologies that are equipped for different jobs. Humans, on the other hand, aside from reproductive labor, like childbearing, everybody is more or less born with the same ability set, the same kind of blank slate body that can do more or less the same tasks as any other human. And then we train each other into whatever roles are necessary. And so humans are meant to be, unlike termites, adaptable to a changing environment. That's kind of, I think, the point. Evolutionarily speaking, the reason that we evolved the way we did is because it was necessary for whatever reason to adapt to changing conditions very rapidly. And so the way this works, so this works in a particular way. Basically, the point is that we can retrain each other. We can organize ourselves into a mode of production, and then as things develop, we can change that mode of production. And we change that mode of production by producing an ideology for ourselves. So let me start reading now. So each new generation of humans finds themselves laboring in society with other humans, producing and reproducing their existence. The conditions of labor include the social relations of society, that is, the relations of production, lord and serf, capitalist and worker, etc. These are called the relations of production. And the tools, roads, factories, water wheels, whatever's available to use, whatever we're actually interacting with to do the production, those are the forces of production. And if you take these two things together as a unity, then they constitute what Marx called the material economic basis for society, or just the base for short, the material base. This basis, I want you to think of it as a store, as the paper, essentially, of a computation. So basically what happens is that these modes of production are imperfect and not stable. Modes of production are usually at best semi-stable. We fall into certain patterns that last a long time, but things are constantly changing. We're constantly revising. We're constantly tweaking. And usually more than tweaking, but we'll get to that. But things are basically always changing. The forces of production tend to develop. So basically what happens is that because things are imperfect, you have unequal relations of production. You just tend to get that. You tend to get situations where where there's a political imbalance of power, of social power between two of the groups, two of the sides of the relations of production. If there's even a slight power imbalance, then as surplus accumulates, that power imbalance will give way to an actual material economic imbalance, and that tends to get worse and worse, essentially. So in any class society, forces of production tend to develop and change, and then in addition to that, inequalities tend to worsen. And so what's happening is that the forces of production are developing, while the relations of production, because there are beneficiaries, because there's winners and losers, tend to stay not changing. And the reason that they're not changing is because the beneficiaries, the ones with the economic power and the social power, they have the power, so they can resist any changes, even if changes are necessary. So the forces of production tend to develop and speed ahead of the relations of production, and people are left in the dust. Inequality worsens, and pockets of society find themselves becoming aware of their oppression. And this is kind of where we get to the computation part. What's happening is that humans in these societies are forming individually, but also as a group, an ideological conception of their own place in it. And in some cases, they're performing, if in the cases where they're being, let's say, abused, they're forming a critique of that society based on the extent to which they can understand its inability to get them what they perceive as their fair share. So you have people forming an ideological conception of their own place in society, in this human society. People are starting to form an ideology in order to make sense of the situation that they just find themselves in. I want to emphasize, every new generation of humans just finds themselves laboring in a particular configuration, and we have to make sense of that. And that's the point. That's the reason that the reason we evolved into this is we produce a critique of the society, and then we change it as is necessary. But there's resistance to that change, right? The relations of production resist, and there's a kind of a clogging up of a dam, and eventually, hopefully, the dam bursts, and then you get a revolution, and very quickly the forces of production are swept aside, and not the forces of production. Very quickly, the relations of production are swept aside and replaced with new ones if the revolution is successful, and that revolution, that very quick, sudden change to the relations of production to one, redistribute wealth more equitably, and two, to sync essentially the relations of production with the forces of production. You get a new mode of production, or at least something that is approaching a new mode of production. You get a very significant change to the organization of society, and so that is a computational step. So that is the sense in which history is computation, and it's built around class struggle. This is what Marx meant when he said in the very first line of the Communist Manifesto, the history of society is the history of class struggles. Class struggle is really the motor of history. It's the point. It's the magma that shifts the tectonic plates. And then in another book, I think it's the 18th Brumaire, Marx says, revolution is the locomotive of history. But I would say that revolution is actually the executive unit. It's the pencil. It's the pencil. That's what it is. And the critique that people are forming of their society, the conception of their place in society, is of course the ideological superstructure, which is also of course the control. So let me draw the picture. And I'm not claiming that this is the only correct or even the correct interpretation of the base superstructure stuff. This is just how I tend to think about it. And I think that but I do think that there's validity to this, and I do think to some extent this is what Marx is getting at with his base superstructure analogy, because he was way ahead of his time with this stupid diagram. This stupid diagram right here, where you have the base down here, and you have the superstructure up here. That is to say, the material base, and the ideological and cultural superstructure. The base influences the superstructure. Human finds themselves laboring in a particular material economic mode, and then the superstructure comes back and influences the base. And this line is controversial. This side, people argue all the time about this. And I think part of the reason that they're arguing about it is because there's multiple lines here. Really, there's lots of little thin lines. Maybe I'll draw it like this. There's lots of little thin lines sometimes. Maybe there aren't. It really depends on the situation. But let's just say there's a lot of little small lines to make my point. But then After a while, after these small lines don't cut it anymore, and things really need to change really fast, and things really kind of get to a point where a breaking point, then you get a revolution. One of the kind of social consciousnesses that's pocketed and forming a really angry critique of society, that's going to boil over, and you're going to get a big change. This is the step. This is I'm going to not use that anymore. So thick line is the step in the computation. Remember when I said all computation is discrete? There are little computations going on, but the ones that really matter, the ones that go in the history books, those are the revolutions. And so I actually drew these lines these arrows kind of backwards according to my usual diagram, but it's very clear, right? You can see already, right? This is the model. This is computation in the sense that this is the store, the material base is the environment, and then the superstructure is obtaining reading from that environment. The social consciousness of humanity is forming a conception. They're taking readings, they're taking input from the paper, from the environment, and they're forming a critique of society. They are processing that, and they are deciding from that to do something, and then they are acting. And they're acting through a medium, and that medium is revolution. So in other words, the base is the store. The superstructure is essentially the control, and revolution is, of course, the executive unit. And so Marx's theory of historical materialism, to me, is just a very broad model, and in my opinion, a very valid model of historical development. And it sees history as computation. Marx was very ahead of his time when he implied this diagram. Obviously, he didn't draw this diagram. Other people did after him. And that diagram that you see is a simplification, just like this is, right? But it's not a coincidence that these look this similar, because as I said, what is computation? We've arrived at this conclusion that computation, if anything, is this kind of a thing. So there you have it. This is what I mean when I say history is computation. I see history as computation personally, because that's how I see historical materialism. So that's the third example. So I want to get this back to computation. I want to start to merge this back with Turing machines in a discussion of that. But before I do that, there is one thing that I feel like it would be irresponsible to not bring up here, and that is the situation. Well, what if you get common ruin? So what Marx says in the beginning of the manifesto is that essentially, the class struggle gives way to either revolution or common ruin. That's essentially the bad ending. The class struggle just entering a permanent stalemate in which things just kind of get shittier and worse for everybody. What happens when that happens? Well, in the past, what's happened in a non-globalized society is that is as simple as a more dynamic society, dynamic in the sense that this computation is going on more, will simply overtake it and integrate it into their own story. That's what happened with the German tribes. That's what happened with the successive Chinese monarchy, dynasties, and so forth, right? Eventually, a bigger fish will come along, or at least a fish with more potential for change. That's what's happened in the past, but now we're a globalized society. So in our new global society, where everybody essentially is subject to the same overall computation like this, what happens when the common ruin occurs there? What common ruin amounts to within this model is that the computation simply stops. It halts. And if the computation were to halt, and humanity were somehow to not get annihilated, and hundreds of thousands of years were to pass, well, what would happen? Well, if the classes aren't changing, if you're not merging towards a classless society, then what's going to happen is that the different classes are going to start to evolutionarily diverge from each other, and you're going to get you're going to get a society that is more similar to our cousins, the termites, right? You're going to get worker termites and non-worker termites. That's what'll happen. So we get back to that situation where, it's a use it or lose it thing, right? This is what makes us different than termites, and if it stops, then we're just going to revert back to termites eventually.